Welcome back to another episode of Money with Ben, where you learn how to manage your money with confidence. My name's Ben, and today we're going to be talking about liquidity. This is a very important question. I'm going to ask you, is your company liquid? Does your company have liquidity? Now you might be wondering, what is liquidity? Liquidity is simply this. It is the ability for an asset to convert into cash. That's simply it. And why is that important? Because many times when we have cash, we also have debt. And with that debt also comes the need to pay back that debt. And as we talked about in the balance sheet before, there are two types of debt. There's current debt and there's long-term debt. Current debt is simply debt that needs to be paid off in less than a year. Long-term debt is debt that needs to be paid off in more than a year. Think about your mortgage that takes about 30 years to pay off. But also bills. You cannot pay a bill in a year. You have to pay your bill in a month or in a couple of months. So the way that you can determine how healthy a business is by determining, does it have the ability to turn its assets into cash in case there is ever a situation that they need to pay off all of their short-term debt in a short period of time. And this can happen pretty often. Sometimes there might be some economic situation in where debts need to be paid off early. There are many cases in where it's just beneficial to get rid of some debt in order to make your company less unstable. But we call this ability to pay off your short-term debt liquidity. And the reason it's the same thing as converting your assets into cash is because the way that you pay off that short-term debt is with cash. You need something liquid to pay off these short-term liabilities. So what I have here in front of me is a balance sheet of Nvidia, similar to what we used when we were talking about trends in our trends video. And we're going to be going over trends as well. There are three major formulas that you can use to determine how healthy your company is when it comes to its ability to pay off its current liabilities. Those are the working capital formula, the current ratio, the quick ratio. There are some other ones, but these are the primary ones that you're going to be using in any of your businesses, and they're pretty universal. Working capital, the formula works like this. What is your total current assets minus your total current liabilities? In other words, if you took all of your assets that you plan on using up in less than a year and you subtracted that by all your liabilities that you need to pay off in less than a year, how much cash would you have left over? That's what the working capital formula is. So let's take a look at Nvidia. If we look at their balance sheet at the end of January 28th, 2024, their total current assets total $44,345. Now, once again, this is in millions. So when this says 44,000, they don't have $44,000 in current assets. They have 44 billion. But just to not take up an entire page, they round it down like that. I'm going to be using thousands simply because it's just easier for me. But just remember, you have to multiply these by a million in order to realize how much they really have. But they have 44,000. Now, let's take a look at the current assets that they have. And I had not mentioned this in the balance sheet video before, but the way that the current assets are listed is actually in order of liquidity. In other words, the assets that are most converted into cash are listed on top, and the ones that are the hardest to convert into cash, in other words, the least liquid, are listed on the bottom. So, of course, you have cash. Cash can be turned into cash because cash is cash. Then you have marketable securities. This is your stocks and your bonds. Those may take a little bit more time to convert into cash, but they're relatively easy. Think about how you can just tell your stockbroker to go sell some stocks and it can happen in either less than a day or in a day or two. Accounts receivable, that is going to take some time to get the money for because you've got to remember, accounts receivable is money that people owe you And sometimes the money that people owe you may not come in a very quick period of time. Sometimes it might take 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, depending on what the terms are for your invoices. Inventory, that can take a little bit longer, especially depending on the type of product that you have. You can probably sell off chocolate bars pretty easily, but it'll be also a lot harder to try to sell off furniture. Also, imagine trying to have to sell off your entire supply of your inventory. All of your chocolate bars, all of your toothpaste, all of your furniture. That's going to take a lot more time than paying off or getting the money from the invoices that you sent. And then you have prepaid expenses and other current assets. Those are just a remainder. I'm not going to go too much into it. They just put it there just so you know that there are other current assets that can be converted into cash in less than a year. So the total current assets is $44,345. Now you subtract that by the total current liabilities, which comprises of accounts payable, bills, accrued and other current liabilities, so they just call that the remainder, and then short-term debt. Those are like mortgages or notes that you can get paid off in less than a year. Their total is $10,631. So if we use the formula again, current assets minus current liabilities, 44,000 minus 10,000, you get 33,714. That's how much cash that they're working with if they sold off all of their current assets and got the cash from them and used all that money to pay off their current liabilities. What you want to see here in the working capital ratio is, first off, is that number positive? Because if that number is negative, and say there's an emergency where you need to pay off all of your bills in a specific point in time, and that working capital ratio is negative, that means you don't have enough cash in order to pay off those bills. You're going to have to find them somewhere. And that can be something very stressful for a business owner. So it's always good to have some amount of cash and some amount of current assets with you, so that way if an emergency comes up like that, you're ready for it, you're prepared for it. The second ratio is the current ratio. Current ratio is current assets divided by current liabilities. So the reason you divide it is so that way you can ask yourself one question. How much assets do I have for every dollar of current liabilities do I have? For example, for every dollar I have in current liabilities, how many dollars in current assets do you have? For Nvidia, if we go back to these numbers, 44,345. You divide that by 10,631, you are going to get 4.17. ... But I'm rounding off to 4.17. That simply means for every dollar in current liabilities that they have $4.17 in current assets. That's a good thing. That means if they paid off every single dollar, they would have plenty of money left over. So it's also important that this number is relatively big. When we say big, the overall average that most people like to say is 1.5 to 2. It simply means that for every $1 in current liabilities, you have $2 in current assets, but it can also depend on the industry. So if we're looking at the universal ratio that is recommended, we can see that 4.17 is pretty big, but once again, this could depend on the type of industry that Nvidia is in. They might need that large amount of current assets in order to see that their current liabilities have been paid off in a specific point in time. There's a lot more information that simply looking at the balance sheet doesn't necessarily tell us. And then we have the quick ratio. The quick ratio is just like the current ratio, except now, rather than looking at all the current assets, they want the quick assets, the ones that are the quickest into converting into cash. Commonly, those are cash and cash equivalents, marketable securities, and accounts receivable. So if you add those three current assets together and then divide that by your total current liabilities, that ratio would determine how much in quick assets do you have in order to pay off that debt. Because there might be a situation in where inventory is getting pretty hard to sell, but you still need to pay off those bills. And those prepaid expenses and other current assets, those might be having a hard time getting sold, but you still need to pay off those current liabilities. And so looking at the quicker, the more liquid current assets, is a better way of looking if there was a really big emergency, how safe are we? How comfortable are we in that situation? And so if you take the total of cash, marketable securities, accounts receivable, so 7,280, 18,704, 9,999, add those together, divide that by 10,631, you're going to get a ratio of 3.38. Once again, that number is pretty high if we're looking at just a general rule, but once again, this could be depending on the industry. But overall, that means if for every dollar that they have in current liabilities, they have $3.38 in quick assets in order to pay those current liabilities off. So that's a pretty good deal in regards to how safe it is. It's not risky in the short term because it's able to pay off its short-term obligations. We also want to make sure that that number doesn't get too high, because you got to remember, yes, we do want cash and we want marketable securities and we want accounts receivable. We want people to owe us money. We'd rather have them owe us money than not owing us at all, in the sense that they're not buying our product. So we do want to have those assets, but we also want those assets at work. We want to see them working for us. We want to see them being used for something more than just getting a little bit of interest in the bank or making a slight percentage in gains on the stock market. We want to see it actually being used for the business. So you want to utilize as much cash and cash equivalents as possible for operating your business and not holding in too long in the bank. That's why we like to say liquid, because cash, it should flow. It's best used when it's flowing like an energy, because that's what gives life to the business. Cash doesn't do you any good if it just stays in the bank. It needs to go in and out. One question that I would have with Nvidia, if I didn't understand the industry, is why is that ratio so big? And I took the liberty of taking a look at the current and quick ratios from the previous years, and it seems like that trend of having the current ratio and the quick ratio relatively large is pretty common. In fact, relatively, it's smaller than it was in the previous years. So it is getting better in utilizing the cash, but this is all depending on how the industry is. But overall, I would say in regards to liquidity, Nvidia is relatively safe if I know nothing else of the industry. It has the current assets and the quick assets needed in order to pay off its short-term obligations. So this was a pretty good example, I think, in determining whether or not a company was safe in paying off its short-term debt. My challenge to you is take a look at the assets that you have that are going to be used up in a year or less. Just like the assets that we mentioned here. How much do you have in total? And then figure out how much liabilities do you need to pay off in less than a year. And you can use that to determine your current liabilities. And see for yourself, what is your working capital formula? What is your current ratio? What is your quick ratio? Do you have enough money in order to pay off your debts whenever emergency happens in the short term? If not, that's something that you can work at. Now, in the next videos, we're going to be looking at other formulas and other ratios to keep an eye out for whenever you are analyzing your business or any other business. But until then, this has been Money with Ben, and I will see you next time.